recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. McGovern, for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, before I start, let me say that although I represent New York State, I want to make sure everybody understands that agriculture is the largest business in New York State, most of that obviously taking place up in eastern western New York along the border, and we do know our cows. A lot of debate on this bill is about food safety and the need to ensure that the products we consume are as safe as they can be. I want to pause a minute here to respond to some of the comments that were made in the Senate just this last week, to which I take a very strong exception. As many of you know, or may not, I would like you to know, I've introduced legislation that would phase out 7 classes of antibiotics that are currently approved for non-therapeutic use in animal agriculture. We held a hearing on the preservation of antibiotics for medical treatment last spring, in which for the first time the new administration acknowledged that the issue of overuse of antibiotics in farm animals is serious and they are seeking a solution. Rules Committee held a hearing on this on July 13th to gather testimony from the administration, the private sector, and the scientific community. Now, why is this bill necessary? Well, estimated 90,000 Americans die every year from infections. They're increasingly resilient against the most powerful antibiotics in the world. 70% of those infections are associated with bacterial pathogens displaying resistance to at least one antimicrobial drug. And as much as 70% of all the antibiotics, can't stress this enough, 70% of all antibiotics and related drugs used in this country go to healthy food animals, not people, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our legislation would in no way infringe upon the use of these drugs to treat a sick animal. It simply bans the non-therapeutic use, the constant daily use by farmers who mix the medicine, which they buy in 50-pound bags, daily to mix it in the food of the livestock, in hope that doing so will prevent the animal from getting sick. Now think about that for a moment. If anyone suggested that you mixed antibiotic every day in your children's cereal, you would think that was crazy. And not only that, you would understand that it is very dangerous, and more importantly, likely only to lead to a new class of drug-resistant superbugs that eventually stop feeling the effects of our best antibiotics. A senator claimed on the floor this week that Denmark, which has instituted the same type of restriction that we call for in this bill on the overuse of antibiotics, was an increase in animal mortality. While criticizing a Time magazine article on this issue, he said, quote, "We only have to turn to our neighbor across the Atlantic to see how a ban on antibiotics is played out. The European Union made a decision to phase out the use of antibiotics as growth promoters over 15 years ago. And in 1998, Denmark instituted a full voluntary ban, which in 2000 became mandatory. After the ban was implemented in 1999, pork producers saw an immediate increase, he said, in piglet mortality and post-weaning diarrhea. In fact, the truth is just the opposite. In a recent letter to Speaker Pelosi and to me, the National Food Institute of Denmark, concerned about the debate, the wrongful debate taking place in the United States, has written us that production has actually increased by 47% from 1992 to 2008. He also said that the mortality of livestock was largely unaffected by the ban, but I will assume that they cleaned up, that they didn't stack up the animals who lived in their feces and rarely set foot outside the confined bin. But it has improved again more recently. And I would like to ask unanimous consent to put a copy of that letter and report into the record today.
Without objection.
In fact, it's my guess that several of my colleagues would agree with me and disagree with our colleague in the Senate. Finally, I want to touch on one other issue relating to the legislation we're speaking of. It's the economy. This is a looming trade issue. Denmark and other European countries are already using strict food safety regulations against American products, as we know. We all know exactly what has happened to our industries with each domestic food poisoning or health scare. Other countries respond by telling us they do not want to import our products, and the losers are our farmers and industry. As this trend continues, I see nothing but downside for American farmers, who may soon be told by more and more countries that their pork, beef, or poultry. May I have 3 additional minutes?
I yield generally 2 additional minutes.
All right. And other products potentially hazardous and cannot be imported. Before I close, I want to speak a bit about an article that appeared on the front page of the Sunday Times, New York Times, this past Sunday. Told about a young woman named Stephanie Smith, 22 years old, who is paralyzed from eating a hamburger. A frozen hamburger bought at a market, and they've traced the genesis of this hamburger, and let me tell you what we found. Meat companies and grocers are barred from selling ground beef tainted by the virulent strain of E. coli after an outbreak at Jack in the Box left 4 children dead. Tens of thousands of people are sickened annually by this pathogen, and the federal officials estimate with hamburger is the biggest culprit. This summer, contamination led to the recall of beef from nearly 3,000 grocers in 41 states. Now, we talk about the cuts of beef that are used in this hamburger. Most of them are trimmings that they get from God knows where. We found in the hamburger that paralyzed Miss Smith, some of it came from Uruguay. But they are low-grade ingredients cut from areas of the cow likely to have contact with feces, which carries E. coli. So the filthy cattle is brought in, and one of the most telling things is there are unwritten agreements between some companies to standing in the way of ingredient testing. Many big slaughterhouses will only sell to grinders who agree not to test their shipments for E. coli, according to officials at 2 large grinding companies. Slaughterhouses fear that one grinder's discovery of E. coli will set off a recall that they sold to others. Food scientists have expressed increasing concern about the virulence of this pathogen, since only a few stray cells can make you sick, and there are no safety issues that we require washing up, scrubbing everything. None of them are at all sufficient against this bug, which has become more virulent, and I avow that that is because they are fed the antibiotic to kill E. coli almost daily. On August 16th, the day Miss Smith's hamburger was made, the number 3 grinder, just a little more?
Yield generally an additional 30 seconds.
All right, I'll do it. The day her hamburger was made, the number 3 grinder at the Cargill plant in Butler, Wisconsin, started up at 6:50 a.m. The largest ingredient was beef trimmings, which they call 50-50, half meat, half whatever, costing 60 cents a pound. The potential for this contamination is present every step of the way, according to both the workers and the federal inspectors. The cattle arrive with smears of feces all over them. They are poorly cased. And even, let me ask you now, to put this in the record. I hope people will read this. I think that we are really heading for a trade disaster, as well as one of the most important things, not making 90,000 Americans sick every year. Yield back.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield to our colleague from